Hey guys, today we're going to be looking at the Cold War, which is going to be the period after World War II. It goes from 1945 generally up to around 1990. Just as a refresher, remember at the end of World War II, you have the United States and the Soviet Union as the two major countries that are around after the war is over with. And this is going to lead to tension. But anyway, before we get into the lesson, make sure you read the indicator below. It's Modern World History 8.3. Illustrate the impact of the Cold War on developing and newly independent countries, including the Soviet Union, the United States, and Chinese involvement in the domestic and foreign affairs such as Egypt, Iran, Iraq, Vietnam, Korea, Chile, Cuba, Guatemala, and the Congo. So we're going to be looking at a good many of these, maybe not all of them, but we're going to look at a good many of them. With that being said, let's get on with our learning objective for this lesson. And the main thing is that we should know who these two countries are, who are the two superpowers, why did they become the superpowers, what were some of the steps that were taken after the war that led to this tension and competition between these two countries. At the end of World War II, Winston Churchill is going to give a famous speech known as the Iron Curtain. And in that speech, he's going to say that an Iron Curtain has descended across Europe. Why do you think he's saying that? Think about that for just a second. And let's talk about how all this really gets started. At the end of the war, there's going to be a conference between the big three. And if you remember from World War II, who the big three were, it was Winston Churchill, it was Joseph Stalin, and it was Harry S. Truman. They're going to be the three Allied leaders who are going to try to decide how they want the rest of the war to play out at this point. Remember, the war's not necessarily over yet. It's not over until August of 1945, but they're already making plans. And when they meet at Potsdam, Stalin comes back and he gives a pretty shocking response to the Allies that he's not going to allow any of these countries that the Soviet Union helped liberate to have democratic elections, meaning that people won't be able to go out and vote. That these communist nations or these countries that the Soviet Union has helped liberated that will become communist are going to be under communism, which means they will not vote for their leaders. This starts the stage for Europe becoming divided. And what you're going to see is you're going to see two ideologies come into conflict. The idea of capitalism, which mainly the countries in Western Europe are capitalist nations, and the idea of communism. Communism, of course, the government controls the means of production. The government controls pretty much everyday life. So it's a big contrast. Whereas with capitalism, mainly democratic nations with free market economies, and so you're going to see these two diverse, separate ideologies come into play, and they're going to be battling against each other after World War II. Of course, the United States and the Soviet Union are going to be known as the superpowers, mainly because their economies are the strongest. They're the strongest military wise after World War II is over with. So therefore, they get this nickname of the superpowers. Alliances are going to be formed with countries in Europe siding with the United States, mainly the Western nations, and the countries in the East, not because they really wanted to, would be forced to side with the Soviet Union. And in both cases, we're going to see weapons and military supplies being brought in to both sides and to try to bolster each side up in case of another war. Churchill again gives his famous Iron Curtain speech where he realizes that if someone doesn't do anything in the West, that communism could possibly take over. And he said the West needed to unite against the idea of communism in Western Europe. Because of these differences in ideology and the struggle between capitalism and communism, this is going to create a sort of hostile environment that is going to last until the 1980s between the Soviet Union and the Western nations, including the United States. The first way that the United States is going to try to combat the spread of communism occurs under Harry S. Truman. Truman, of course, was the president after the end of World War II. But in 1947, he comes up with this plan known as the Truman Doctrine, basically saying that the U.S. would provide aid to democratic governments who felt threatened by communism. So it's mainly looking out for these countries in Western Europe who felt like these Eastern European countries might try to overtake them and force them to become communist as well. So the Truman Doctrine is giving aid to these countries that felt threatened. Most of that aid would come in the form of money, mainly through another plan that we're going to discuss in just a few minutes, known as the Marshall Plan, as well as military supplies as well. So, if you were feeling threatened, the United States was willing to help out. The United Nations was established at the end of World War II. Remember, we talked about the League of Nations after World War I, which failed miserably. But after World War II, the United Nations was created to help ensure world peace. And the United Nations actually was put on American soil in New York City, which is still there today. Basically saying that the United Nations was on the United States side. The U.S. during this period would continue the development of nuclear weapons. Remember, the United States was the first to have an atomic bomb. And mainly, these weapons are going to be used for both offensive and defensive strength. Of course, offensively, in case we were attacked, we could launch a nuclear missile at whoever was attacking us. And defensively, you wouldn't want to attack us because we've got nuclear bombs and could do a lot of damage to any country that threatened us. So the idea after World War II was the idea of containment, that communism should be contained. And the way the United States is going to address it is through the Marshall Plan, which is also referred to as the European Recovery Plan. General George C. Marshall, who was once a famous military general during World War II, is now the Secretary of State. He comes up with this plan, and he would offer money to economically depressed countries during this period after World War II. And this was a way to try to encourage those countries to side with the United States and not with the Soviet Union. He felt that this needed to be done because if these countries failed economically, then the possibility of communism taking over would have created a lot of problems for the United States and Europe. So, again, the money was being offered to try to help these nations out and to prevent them from falling to communism. The United States, of course, is going to invest in post-war economies through the Marshall Plan, and the Soviet Union is going to respond with their own economic relief package known as Comecon, or communist economies. Again, this is not going to be very successful because the Soviet Union's economy is really not the same as the United States economy, and the Soviets are going to fail miserably when trying to help out some of their communist allies. During this period, too, we get an arms race between the Soviet Union and the United States to see who could build the most nuclear weapons. The U.S. Is the first with an atomic bomb, but the Soviet Union is going to respond back eventually with their own atomic bomb in the late 1940s. And now there's an arms race to see who can build the most weapons and the most missiles. This buildup occurs during this period after World War II, and it's going to carry through the 1950s and the 1960s. This arms race is going to continue. People began to become very paranoid that they could possibly be attacked by the Soviet Union. Here in the United States, they began to build bomb shelters. the emergence of the rocket fueled what we would come to know as ICBMs. These are intercontinental ballistic missiles. These missiles could be launched from anywhere, and they could fly from continent to continent, and that's why they were known as ICBMs. The arms race is also bolstered by the space race, and who would be the first to get into outer space. And a lot of people felt like that if the Soviet Union got into space first, that it could be a possibility that they could shoot a nuclear warhead down at the U.S. or attack other countries from outer space. And so the United States and the Soviet Union began to compete with each other to see who could do the most in the space race. The Soviet Union was the first to get into outer space with the launch of Sputnik 1 in 1957. The U.S., their main accomplishment during this period was the Apollo missions, where we put a man on the moon for the first time in 1969. New alliances were formed. The United States is going to help organize a new alliance in Europe, Western Europe, known as NATO, which is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It was founded in 1955. And the Soviets would respond with their new alliance called the Warsaw Pact, which was established in 1955 as well to help out communist nations that had allied themselves with the Soviet Union. The U.S. also created two more alliances to stop the spread of communism. The first one, SEATO, SEATO, was formed in Southeast Asia to keep the spread of communism out of Southeast Asia. And the other one was CENTO, which was in Central Europe, mainly in the Middle East, to stop the spread of communism into the Middle East. So these were some of those new alliances. You definitely want to make sure you know these alliances. Again, here's a picture of how Europe was pretty much divided. All of that you see in red was mainly the Warsaw Pact. All of it that you see in the light blue was mainly NATO. So you can see how Europe is divided and how that Iron Curtain had descended all the way across Europe. The first real confrontation of the Cold War, what some people would consider a confrontation, happened in Germany. Of course, Germany during the war, controlled by Adolf Hitler. We had the Nazis. The Nazis are now gone. The Soviets had advanced from the east into Germany, whereas the United States had advanced from the west. And after the war is over with, Germany is going to be divided. And this division is what's going to lead to problems, because the western portion was going to be controlled by the Allies, the eastern portions by the Soviet Union. France, Great Britain, and the United States would control the West. East Germany would be controlled by the Soviet Union. West Germany would mainly become a democratic nation. East Germany would become a communist nation, much like the Soviet Union. The other problem that they had was the capital city of Berlin. Berlin was also divided like the rest of Germany, but Berlin was in the eastern section. So West Berlin was democratic, and East Berlin was communist. And this is going to create a problem because the Soviet Union is going to blockade all of Berlin. And in order for them to get supplies, we would have an event known as the Berlin Airlift, where the United States and the Allies would fly supplies in and out of Berlin to make sure that they didn't fall to communism. This Berlin airlift would last for about 10 months, and eventually East Germany and the Soviet Union gave up on the idea of taking West Berlin from East Germany and the Soviet Union. Again, West Berlin would be independent and democratic. And the East Germans, after this event, shortly after in the 1950s, would erect a wall in Berlin, dividing the city between East and West. And this wall would remain in place until 1989. Germany is going to remain divided into East and West as well until 1989. When the Berlin Wall falls, Germany will be reunited, and it is a reunited country even to this day. Okay, that's where we're going to stop for this first lesson on the Cold War. Um, Please make sure you know the key vocab. Make sure you know what the Berlin Airlift is. Make sure you know those different alliances. Understand the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan and their objective. Know what the policy was for the United States after war was over with in regards to the Soviet Union. And of course, know that the United States and the Soviet Union were the superpowers. But go back and look at this, review it, and watch it as many times as you need to, as we are headed for a test probably coming in the next week or so. So please be prepared to know these things and review, and hopefully that will get you going. I will catch you guys on the next one.